Somebody else might know this. I can't think of any other. Well,
all right. Well, welcome everybody. One of the last talks of the day. I know it's been a long day, but thank you for coming down. My name is Jay. I'm from a company down in Providence called Oomph, and I'm the director of design and UX there. I was the lead UX UI designer on a redesign project we did for Blue Cross Blue Shield and their main marketing site, bcbs.com. I'm going to focus today on the design the whole design process we went through, why we chose paragraphs, and how we designed a flexible system for them to create and manage a lot of their marketing landing pages, including their homepage. So with a project like this, I like to start way at the beginning with their previous site. This client had a typical challenge. We've probably all heard something like this or seen something like this. They had a legacy system that was rigid, had an admin experience that was not user-friendly at all. So they were creating workarounds internally, which meant they were not spending their time wisely or efficiently. The current site was not mobile-friendly, and this was 2016, or responsive, and their analytics was showing, surprise, surprise, an increase in mobile users. I kind of likened it to the kind of thing where they talked about their current system like you would talk about a relative that you don't quite like. You know, there's furtive glances over the shoulder to see if they're listening, sort of whispering why Uncle CMS was a bit old school, but we still loved him. It was pretty much that kind of experience. And anything interesting, you know, on the site was typically an image. So these little nice data points were not responsive at all, not readable on mobile very well. That sidebar to me just screamed 2010. So everyone in the room, luckily, knew it was time to move on. So we know the territory a little bit. I'd like to take a step back and tell you how we approach these sorts of problems when we're contracted for a redesign. We follow a pretty particular process, and I can review that pretty quickly here. Like a lot of people, we always start with some sort of discovery phase, long or short. All we're trying to do there is gather data. And with this big kind of company, we were doing a lot of user interviews. We were doing a lot of looking at their analytics, heat maps. We put a user survey up on the site for a couple weeks. We did a lot up front to try to gather as much data as possible, figure out what their pain points were. From there, the design process moves from low fidelity to high fidelity, from blurry to sharp, right? So the information architecture comes first. Sometimes that's simply called a sitemap, and that is started to try to create a solid foundation for us to build on later. Usually around the same time, I introduced this to the Oomph process, something I call a content wireframe, but I've heard other people talk to it as a content map. But essentially, you know, we don't do this for every page, but typically for the really important ones, it makes a lot of sense just to type out what the content's going to be on this page. What's the hierarchy top to bottom? What's the story that a page needs to tell? You know, what are the headlines, the body copy, the calls to action? The nice thing about this approach, this kind of bulleted approach, is that it's very similar to the mobile experience, right? It's very top down. You start with an idea, you narrow in, you got a call to action, maybe you introduce another idea. That kind of approach is a nice way to start wireframing without even wireframing. And we did use this on a couple of their key landing pages where we really had to figure out a different way to tell a story that they were telling on their previous site. From there, two things usually happen in tandem. One team is doing a simple gray box wireframe, trying to give some pages some structure, while another team is working on the visual aspects of the brand and exploring some design options with something called style tiles. So the wireframes I liken to the 2x4s or for the walls and the floors, while the style tiles show the client what the furniture and what the finishes are actually going to look like without having to truck in a couch. You know, we're showing them carpet and wallpaper samples in the way of color and typography and photography, how we're going to use certain form elements in a very structurally agnostic way. The wireframes will explore the mobile structure, multiple viewports sometimes, but the style tiles are definitely viewport agnostic. From here, finally, we can take those two things now and start to do some page mockups. Start to give them a much better, much clearer, less fuzzy idea of what some of these pages will start to look like. In this day and age with responsive, it doesn't make sense to mock up a lot of pages. You try to identify those key pages up front. And then our designer will typically put together a component guide or a style guide so that we can build out those other pages that aren't already covered by some of the page mockups that we will be showing them. At the very end, I consider code to be the highest fidelity, right? From here, some other processes will kick off. This is just our design process, grant you, like quality assurance, bug hunting, user acceptance, testing, that kind of thing. And as these things are happening on the UX front, typically, our engineering team is exploring options for modules, APIs, custom code, and starting to formalize the infrastructure with a build spec. So this is the process that we applied to the BCBS project. So now that we know the territory a little bit, we know how we're going to start to draw that map. Let's dive into some of the things we learned during the discovery process with these guys. Our contact over there was really great in the way that he had a great creative eye. And when we started to look at their direct competitors in the healthcare space, it became pretty clear right away that all of them were stuck in a pretty similar paradigm. They had sites that felt old, they were small, they were centered for large screens, they had a poor hierarchy of content, poor contrast, and they had a lot of competing calls for action, right? So rather quickly, we decided to look for inspiration outside of the healthcare industry. It just was not going to be helpful. One of the ones that we looked at in their hometown of Chicago was the Museum of Science and Industry. This had a very nice non-grid-like structure to a really long format site that did a great job of storytelling while conveying some of the necessary information that someone needs to just plan a trip. This was, you know, we looked at some other storytelling sites as well, which were very visually driven. One of the sites we looked at was actually called Maptia. It's a journalistic photography site, a lot of big photos and some simple flourishes. And in the end, all of this nice inspiration was great, but it wasn't directly applicable to BCBS. They're a healthcare company. Their goal was to get a client of theirs to understand that to get a new member card or find out what my health insurance even covered, I needed to go off to my local plan. BCBS was not really the place for me. I needed to go to my local state plan. But they had to do that education, and they had to make sure that they were still meeting the needs of their existing users. So they had to have a different approach. So we dialed it back a little bit, and then we started to look at other national insurance retailers. And one of them happened to be Progressive.com. Say what you will about their spokesperson or the fact that they have ads that seem to be running everywhere all the time. But their website is refreshingly restrained, actually, and very focused on usability and getting that story. They have a very short homepage, and they have landing pages like these that can really cater to their core market verticals. So BCBS could start to see how they could follow this model a little bit more closely than some of the other things that we were looking at. But visually, they did have those other models in mind. So with inspiration in our minds, it was time to explore the BCBS brand itself and some of the particulars of the new site structure. So we started with style tiles. These are what some of those looked like. Because they did have an existing brand that was pretty strong and had a lot of guidelines to it, but they were still mostly geared towards print. And things like this Universe font family with a million different weights wasn't really going to work well on the web. It was going to make the page load really slow. So we had to be careful and use this kind of exploration to really pick out some of the key highlights from their brand and expand it a little bit for the web. Get some colors that looked better on screen, had more tints and more variants. And so that was part of what we were doing here. Then, as I said, at the same time, we're working on wireframes. We're looking at some of these really non-hierarchical pages, like a news landing page. It became really clear that we would need to divide things up into rows and columns to start to compartmentalize different sets of content that were related. Landing page for the news section, which needed media contacts and some general about and some outreach initiatives and some timely content. The design tried to start to bring some storytelling to the forefront. And by storytelling, I really meant like, what kind of user are you? What are you looking for? Here's a pastiche of everything you can find in this particular section. Here's a wide range of things that you can review and figure out what is really pertinent to you and what you want to get out of the site. Here's some other examples of that kind of approach. Corporate social responsibility. They needed to tell a certain story. This was to their investors, this was to their partners. So the audience is a little bit different, but there's lots of different pieces and types of content. In Drupal terms, you know, at the bottom of this page is a view of other kinds of content. And here on a different page, member services, this really speaks to that user that needs to understand, this isn't quite my home. I need to go to my local plan. I need to go to bcbsma.com, for example. But still, they wanted to be able to tell the story about, okay, if you are here, here's some other options for you. Here's global coverage. Here's coverage for travel, that kind of thing. As an aside, you know, we're going through all this last year, sort of banging our heads against the wall. A lot of other people have the same problem. And then this April, the father of responsive design, Ethan Marcotte, who will be here tomorrow, awesome. He was giving a talk at Event Apart in Seattle. The talk that we'll be hearing tomorrow, actually. And on the topic, this topic of designing beyond our devices, one of the things he says was, instead of pages, we should design networks of content that are composed of patterns. And these patterns, which are small, responsive patterns themselves, can be stitched together to create composite experiences that are kind of like pages. And I didn't think about it at the time in such a succinct way, but this is ultimately what we wanted and what we tried to build. So that's happening kind of in parallel. So all of those design exercises started to drive home that we needed a flexible, component-based system of predefined options that will allow authors to create pages without thinking about the design or the mobile responsiveness. And the question really became, well, what solution is going to give us what we want? And as the name of the talk suggests, we chose the Paragraphs module. For those of you who are unfamiliar, and I can't imagine there's too many of you out there anymore, Paragraphs adds a new field type that works like entity references. And you can predefine all sorts of types of paragraphs to give your end users, anything from a simple text block to a slideshow. A quick shout out here to the development team behind the module and the strong community of maintainers out there. And this is kind of how it works. So briefly, on the left is a typical body field for a post. And on the right is how they illustrate how you can drop and like start to chop that up, chunk it up into paragraph types that can even support blocks and entity references themselves. Bullet, though, is what really piqued our interest. We can add and configure custom option fields and create our own bundles, essentially. So what did we see in the paragraph module that we didn't see in some other similar solutions? Well, we could define the options that an author will have available as they design a page. They can create as many rows as they need, choose the layouts of elements in that row, configure those options, and move those pieces around after the fact. It gave them a lot of flexibility, but it did not give them unlimited options. What other solutions do, and unlimited flexibility means that an author can really go off the rails and go against those brand standards. And that's exactly what you don't want. And that seemed to be one of the things that Paragraphs really let us control very well. So we had wireframes, we were doing some page mockups, some early exploration, but now we had to figure out how we were going to build it. So I'm going to go through how we started to break things down into small reusable components. A previous talk actually mentioned atomic design as well, so I'm glad to hear that's out in the ether. This methodology is essentially trying to break things down to their smallest reusable pieces, right? It was coined by Brad Frost for just as a way of defining interface elements. So if a search form is an example, your atoms are the label, the input field, the search button. Your molecule is how they work together as a single unit. And then the organism, that next piece in the chain, is how they might sit next to your navigation. A template is perhaps like how it works in the header, and then a page uses all those pieces together, right? So it's a way to define one piece made up of smaller pieces and try to reuse those as consistently as possible. With that in mind, we worked backwards and started to look at our designs and break them down into the smallest common components that we could. So the rows and columns started to be built with what we defined as our atoms. Our atoms were an icon, which is optional, a background, which is simply a color or an image, and WYSIWYG content. Pretty simple. But this became what we later called the card. We also defined the options at the same time, and this was where the power came in. We had only 3 atomic elements, but those elements had a lot of options available to them. So they included icon selection itself, color of the icon, background colors, background gradients, vertical alignment of a card within a larger row, and text themes, so they could quickly say, I need white text on a dark background or light text on a white background, something like that. And we also had some custom classes that would be available to them in CK Editor. So all these atoms and properties became our molecule, what we ended up calling the card. Card can support many things, and the options allowed authors to create a lot of variety, seen in some of these examples. They have access to a controlled set of options, again, and can use some or all of the atomic elements that we gave them. The WYSIWYG editor also added a lot of flexibility with a lot of header styles and button styles and stylistic overrides. So they were able to work with a lot of variety there. So since our molecule is a card, our organism became the row, or in this case, a paragraph bundle. A row can contain up to 4 cards for this particular build. And all in all, we've configured about 10 different paragraph bundles for them. The wireframe examples I have here top down are what we call a single card hero, which is typically over a really big background color or image. 3 card hero under that can also have an image associated with it. An image card row, which is a way to pair 2 things together tightly, and a video card row. And each of these bundles have responsive design built in. They are small responsive patterns that could be stitched together to create pages. Once we put the design skin on these wireframes, you can start to see how we're able to make the hero image and the cards themselves bleed together a little bit more. They don't feel like they're different components. So these atoms and properties and molecules start to form the basis for our flexible page layouts. For an author, all they have to do is think about the type of presentation for their content and choose the right options to support it. The design system tries to do the rest. So some quick examples of what the responsiveness is. It is pretty simple, but the big takeaway here is that the author really doesn't have to think about it. A typical 2-card hero like this stacks for mobile, surprise, surprise, but the author has an option to hide the image if it's not really important enough, and it's just going to make the page longer. And the desktop version displays them side by side. The author does have options for width of those cards, so they're not always a 50-50 split. They can also be a 33-67 split if they so choose. So it really depends on what kind of content they're trying to put forward. Another quick example, that video card idea. It's simple again, but we took care to make the correct choices for mobile first. In this case, with both the image and the video card, there are options for desktop, left, right, or continuing to put it on the center. But mobile always adheres to the best practice of leading with the video or the image first. Again, one more thing they don't have to think about, but something that we just baked right in. To round out the atomic idea, a template here is shown to give you kind of a more complete picture in Drupal speak of what the regions are for a typical page. So we had to make a decision, because we wanted to support regular body content as well, where to put that consistently. So as you see here, what we ended up doing is putting the body content and the featured image and header above flexible content. So flexible content can really stack the whole page up, but they have an option to use a featured image as well, and they have an option to use body content as well. They just don't have an option of really dragging and dropping where those things are going to be. But the flexible content area can be made up as many rows as they want, and they don't have to use anything else on the page besides the header and the footer. So since this is a Drupal admin, thought I might show you guys the admin. If that makes sense, right? So to give you a better idea now, we're looking at the edit screen for a particular page. And the first thing you see in Drupal 8 is the fact that we put flexible content first. That was their decision. They wanted to really push that on authors, so that's the first thing you see. But basic info will hold your body content. Media will hold your featured image if you choose to use that. And the first view you get is all the different rows that are active on that page. So they're kind of generic right now. We're working on giving them better titles, but this gives you an overview of the layout of that page and all the content there. This just kind of zeroes in and lets you see what we're really talking about. And that add body text at the bottom is how you would add another row to this. So you click on that, and you get a little drop down of all the different paragraph bundles that we've configured that they can choose from. So you see a couple other here that I didn't yet mention, but like I said, those are the 10 that they have available. Go to another screen. If we open up one of those rows by clicking edit, we can see the cards that are inside and all the options available for those cards. So again, this gives them the flexibility that they're looking for while still locking them into a certain set of options. The detail here shows that we've got vertical alignment, an optional background image, color, icon, text theme, and a gradient color. So these are the options that I'm talking about there. And it's not pretty, but it does work really well. And again, they've got probably 19 colors to choose from, 3 different gradients, put any 300 icons, that's all available right there. That's a particular card, but certain rows also have options as well. So further down the page under the cards, which are indented, each paragraph row has its own little options. So this 2-card row has options for layout width, has options for the hero, and the optional Boolean for whether or not this is going to display on mobile. So that's a pretty quick overview of how this ends up working and looking for them when they're editing and creating content. And again, all that admin, this is the front end display of that particular piece. So let's look at a few examples of what the client ended up building with these rows. So again, this is where they were with their previous home page, and this is where they were a few months ago. They change their home page pretty often. So if you visit it now, I think it's a little bit different. It's a single card hero over a 67-33 split. And before that, they had 3 cards along the bottom. But that's the power of this right now, is that they're able to change their home page up like anything else. It makes it really, really flexible for them. And then here again is where they were with their previous news section or their media center. And here's how it ended up looking after some of our page mockups. So it even looks a little bit more different than what you saw previously. And we can probably start to break down into rows after you've seen how we define some. A 3-card row, another 3-card row, a single card hero, 2-card row, and then this is a view from a blog, and this is a view from a different blog. So the nice thing there is, two, is that with the templates, your flexible content can come before any other custom views that you need to build out as well. And then finally, I like this one because the client did this completely by themselves. We didn't mock it up. We just gave them the tools, and they started to put this together. So I really like the way they ended up choosing some muted tones at the beginning as they moved down the page into a more modern treatment to really tell the history and put everything into context. So again, there were a number of major landing pages that we did do during the design process, but this just didn't happen to be one of them. Of course, you can see a lot more on the site now that it's live. We launched that back in November. And see if you can spot the paragraph rows. Of course, there's there's views and other things in the page as well. It's not all paragraphs, but now that they have that and their marketing team has been really comfortable starting to use it, I've seen it start to creep into a lot of other pages as well. We'd be remiss if we didn't mention a lot of the other modules that we ended up using for this project. Some of them are necessary for paragraphs, like the entity reference revisions. But the responsive image module as well was really, really helpful for this kind of thing, because the focal point module coupled with that made the mobile performance really, really great and allowed them to control making sure that people's faces were always in view, things like that, so that they were really able to keep on brand but be as mobile friendly as possible. And Chosen, I want to give a shout out to that one, because when you have 300 icons, Chosen makes that list a lot easier to navigate. It inserts a nice little keyword search right into a select list, so it makes a select list a lot more digestible and much better for the user. Well, thank you for your patience on the whole journey here. I'd like to open up the floor for questions if you have them, and if it's really, really technical, I'm going to call on John in the back there, who helped build this beast. So we should be able to answer any kind of question you might have. And if you're just too tired because it's been a long day, that's quite all right too. Yes?
Do you find that
oh, sorry.
things that you've set up with paragraphs, given the structure of paragraphs, you end up with a whole bunch of sites that look the same because that's the path of least resistance?
That was certainly in the back of my mind. And I think when you have a really strong brand like this, you might run into that anyway. But I think that's one of the reasons why we gave them so many options, right? So 19 colors for background is a lot. 300 icons is a lot. But one of the reasons why we did that is to make sure that they could really address a lot of different variety as much as possible. And you started to see, again, because the marketing department is pretty savvy, it looks like they have a decent sensibility when it comes to building out a page with black and white imagery or adding overlay for color and things like that. So they were able to use the tools pretty effectively. I think that's always going to be a challenge, but that's certainly one of the things that we tried to design with an eye towards. Instead of giving them only 6 colors, 5 colors, giving them just a lot more that all works within their brand is going to help get away from that. I think the biggest thing that probably happens is just the fact that this is very boxy. It's a very boxy solution. And there's not too much way around that other than the way that I think we were able to blend background photography into card content a little bit more seamlessly to make those feel like bigger pieces. But yeah, that was certainly something that was in the back of our minds. And your question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So in this project, what do you feel is most challenged part?
What was the most challenging part?
Yeah, from the beginning to the end.
To some degree, reining them in. So, you know, we also had a roadmap for like phase 2, phase 3. There's some paragraph types that will be part of that we couldn't address right away. But giving them this like framework that is like, hey, you've got almost unlimited options, was really exciting, but also really got their wheels turning and made them want more, which I think is a good problem to have. It reinforced the fact that we gave them a solution that was really going to work for them and for their team, which I think is an important point. If they were not a very savvy Drupal team, I don't think I would have given them so many options in the back end, so many different drop downs and things they could choose. But we just were able to manage to hit that sweet spot of their own comfort level and their own sense of, well, I want to be able to design almost everything. And, try to rein them in a little bit to say, well, fit within this framework, fit those ideas within this framework. And when you hit something that you really want to do that you can't do, come back to us. So I think that was one of the bigger challenges. And just the technical challenge, I think, is pretty high in something like this. Figuring out how to build it, what the options are, and then front-end theming them is still a lot of hours, a lot of time. But I think it really made us believers in paragraphs as a solution. And there's a lot that we learned from it that we can now apply to other clients. And almost, we're still figuring it out, but how do you make a base level package that you can just give everybody and then build on that and customize it per project? That's kind of where we're going. Yeah. Yeah.
Is custom theme required, or will paragraphs dovetail with some of the contributing themes nicely?
Custom themes are not required. Actually, for a hack day recently, we played around with Bootstrap Paragraphs. So you can download that module, install it, and you immediately have access to a Bootstrap-driven theme that has paragraphs built in with, I forget how many, but they've got half a dozen to 10 probably pre-built paragraph options. And they actually do some pretty cool stuff where they've got one row that could be 1 card or 6. 8 cards up to 6 as you want. So they are doing some actually pretty interesting things on the configuration side. I think it helps. I think for this kind of thing, the power came from giving them a design that was really just based on their brand. Again, for us, the challenge was, how do you give them enough rope not to hang themselves, essentially? You don't want them to go rogue. You don't want them to feel like, I'm just going to do stuff in the WYSIWYG and change the font color and all this stuff. Instead, if you gave them enough options that they really felt like they had a lot of things that they could do and a lot of control, but they didn't have unlimited options, I think that's where now they're more comfortable sticking with that brand and sticking with those options, because they don't have a need necessarily to do something that's wild and out of place. Yeah.
Just so, was there much training that you needed to do with them?
There was definitely some training. They were coming off of a non-Drupal project. They were coming off of a closed source system. So they already knew they wanted to ditch that. Our contact was really comfortable with Drupal, actually, and he helped me do this talk actually at DrupalCon, which was cool. So he was a believer, but he had to get his team up to speed. And so we definitely had some training there. But really, if you know how to type into a WYSIWYG and you know how to use little form elements and drop downs, it's not that hard. What we did for them, I think that was most helpful, was our designer put together a PDF of described all the rows and did some visual examples of what they could do. What is really the breadth of what you can do when you mix these 3 elements together, essentially, a icon, text, and a background color. And I think that was really effective in showing them look, it could be a solid color, it can be a gradient color, it can be background image, it could be floating on top, it can have transparency, it doesn't have to have transparency, you know? And that could really get their wheels turning. Yeah. Yeah.
If you need to use a single paragraph on 2 pages, how would you choose that?
If you wanted to use the same thing on 2 pages?
Yeah.
That's phase 2, actually. I know there's a module, we met the, one of the contributors to Paragraphs at DrupalCon in Baltimore, and he kind of shared a little bit of their roadmap with us, and copying paragraph config from one page to another is part of their roadmap. I think there'll be a module out for that eventually. Yell at me if I'm saying something wrong, John. And then one of the other things I know that they want that I don't think they have yet is the ability to stage a draft version of the homepage before making that. Because it's one single page, it's hard to do that right now. But that's something else that we're going to try to work on for them, so they can preview a new homepage design seamlessly and just launch it, just kind of flip the switch on it. Anyone else? Yeah.
You answered my question, how do they work? Do they work content online? And it sounds like they do.
Well, 2, they're healthcare, so the security is pretty high. There's like you can't just go to bcbs.com/admin. That doesn't exist. So there's like a whole way to get into the content management system. There's a staging site where they stage a lot of content and currently stage the home page. And then they essentially have to copy that over manually to production. It's not great. We're going to try to make that better for sure. But we're also up against their security restrictions. So it's a little bit more complicated. Yeah. Anyone else? All right, it's 5:10. We're all fried. Thanks for everybody for sticking it out.
Thank you.